Welcome, everybody. This is the final session in a series we're calling an Introduction to the Constitution. It's the preface to a teaching of the Constitution of the United States online after the pattern we use here at Hillsdale College. My name is Larry Arnn. In this last session, I have a great privilege, and so do you, an old and good friend of mine, more than 20 years, probably more than 25 years now, radio talk show host, law professor, fun guy, great man, Hugh Hewitt is here. And he and I are going to talk. He's going to ask some questions. Probably some of them are his, and many of them are coming from you. And I'll mention that this is the first of many opportunities you're going to get to ask people from Hillsdale College questions about things we study and teach here. So this session will be an introduction to that process, and we're going to go. Welcome, Hugh.
Dr. Arnn, it is good to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm going to start, for the benefit of those who've not seen the first 5 sessions of this series, would you recap why you did it, what is in it, and just why has it been so wildly successful with tens of thousands of people watching it?
Well, it's because those people are great. The virtue of them is in them. Why are we doing it? The Constitution of the United States is in great disrepair these days, disrepute, surely. It's thought by the scholarship to be separated from the principles of the country. They think that it's incompatible with the Declaration of Independence, and they think it's a series of technicalities that can't be held up anymore. Passé, it's over. We have to have some new form, and by the way, thankfully, we do have a new form, the modern administrative state, and it's better. So the first step to figure out whether all that's true or not is to understand what the Constitution says. And I've said that it says 3 main things. It's got lots of details in it, but there are 3 things about it to know. One of them is it prescribes, just as the Declaration of Independence requires, a limited government where the ultimate source of authority is in a vibrant, thriving, private society. Following from that, and made possible by that, is a representative form of government in which everybody working in the government represents those outside it. And then finally, because you have a representative system, it follows from that, the people can delegate their authorities to different branches and different levels of government, and so you can have separation of powers. And if you understand those 3 things, you understand the basic requirements of constitutionalism, and those, it seems to me, are things beautiful to understand and things we could be working on. Now, one could do something about those things.
Why tens of thousands of people? It's very unusual for a college to do a course that has that kind of subscription.
Yeah,
Why?
I think it might be over 100,000
right
now. And probably this one will have more because you're here.
I'll talk about it for sure.
Yeah, why? Well, I think, first of all, it's not even a controversial thing to say. Our country is at a moment of a pivot. It's going to be what it was, or it's going to be fully what it is now. And those 2 things are mutually exclusive. It can't be partly one and partly the other. A choice has got to be made. And we're near to making the choice. And just as has happened in every great crisis in American American history, the people sit up and take notice. This is important, they think. I had better learn about this.
Now, you said in the introduction, Constitution is in disrepair. The big question, is it beyond repair? And there are some who believe, like Sparta, which lasted 600 years, every republic has its run, and we're close to the end of this one. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I think you and I have been talking about Winston Churchill for 20 years. He didn't believe in trends, he believes in choices. We have choices before us. The Constitution will live if it lives in us. And as I say, there are these 3 things about it. Like, could you have a limited government in this day and age? Well, if you delegate some things back to the people, I mean, it's not really delegating back to them, it's them retrieving them because they're the natural owners of them. The government could be smaller. Could you have a representative government? Well, if you did something about these regulatory agencies that don't represent anybody, yeah, you could do it. Could you have separation of powers? If you did something about these regulatory agencies that are the executive, legislative, and judicial branches all wrapped into one, could you do something about that? The laws that would do something about that are actually pretty simple, and they're statute laws, and they could be passed. So is it beyond repair? It depends. Depends on what we want.
6 weeks ago, I was flattered. Associate Justice of the Supreme Court Stephen Breyer came to my radio studio in California and sat down for a 2-hour conversation about his book, Making Our Democracy Work. He is a proponent of the administrative state, of the other choice, the one that you are not advocating for. And as we went round and round within the rules, no politics, no current cases, we came back twice to his summation statement, which is, George Washington, I paraphrase, but the transcript is up. George Washington and the framers didn't know about the internet. And packed into that is the assumption that life's just too complicated, Larry Arnn, for this old Constitution. What do you think?
There you go. And the truth of the matter is, first of all, it's true. George Washington didn't know about the internet. But Stephen Breyer is in a bad spot if he makes that argument, because he has his authority to make that statement that he just made in a forceful way as a chief agent of American law because of an oath he took to the Constitution. So are things changed so greatly that such oaths don't matter anymore? Now, Breyer, I happen to believe, because I know some people who know him, is a great guy. I think you've said that too.
Yes, very much.
Fine human being, so I'm not calling him a liar or anything like that. But here's the second thing. If you look at the Constitution in the grand sense, about those three things I named, then those are said by James Madison in the 51st Federalist to turn on a simple proposition. We require to have government because we are not angels. But government requires to be limited because angels do not govern us, at least not directly. The people in government are like us, just as we are all, the people of America, are capable of doing wrong. So the people in the government are capable of doing wrong. Both should live under the limits that are appropriate to human nature. Now, I don't think that Justice Breyer claims that that has changed. If he does change that, he should read the newspaper.
He believes in the progressive state. He believes in expertise. He believes that this is just too complicated for ordinary people to make these choices. And I want to go back to a conversation we had with some of your Hillsdale College students earlier today, and to link it up to Hamilton. In Hamilton 78, in the Federalist 78, Hamilton argues for a very, very robust executive. And increasingly, in the speed in which we live, the temptation is to give that president and the administrative state that he presides over the authority he needs to get the job done, protect the country, and make our life. Didn't Hamilton make that argument in the convention? Didn't Hamilton actually foresee where we are, and hasn't he won, and shouldn't you just get over it?
Well, to paraphrase Gerald Ford, if Alexander Hamilton were alive today, he'd be spinning in his grave. No, of course that's not what he argued. Because in the case of an international crisis where urgent action is necessary, we have a very powerful executive, and he can go. He's got a bunch of really capable people. You were talking about some Navy SEALs, earlier today, right? You want to send those guys somewhere, they might do some damage. And he's got the power to send them, just as George Washington had when he was president. That's right. But by the way, why do you need sudden and expeditious power to manage the health care inside my family? Why is that? What complexity about that makes it necessary for somebody else to figure that out for us? Are we less than the ones who went before us? It seems to me that that argument from complication. Here's another point. Was it a simple society in 1776? They named the Congress and the Army, the Continental Congress and the Continental Army. They had never seen the continent. It would be almost a generation before they did. No one had ever created a government like this before, ever. No one had ever, from nothing, waged war upon a major empire and won it. And no one had any model for a constitution like the one that we built. That was very complex. They found the simplicity in the middle of it to build something enduring. And nothing's changed that makes that thing not enduring.
Well,
today.
the microscope has arrived. We know the threats that exist in the environment. We now study and must give to the Environmental Protection Agency and to the Food and Drug Administration and to the South Coast Air Quality Management District.
Friends of ours.
All friends of ours. A variety of powers to cope with these scientific discoveries. They're revelations. We now have a new revelation. It's a scientific revelation, and we can't really leave it to the student Hilldale or the people who don't go to college to make decisions about how to cope with that?
Yeah, okay. And you know, they have this thing, they had this group, at least back when you and I used to work together on something, the Stevens Kangaroo Rat. Wasn't that something? I used to think we need to find the Stevens Kangaroo Cat. Sorry.
I wish I'd had that line 20 years ago when we were fighting this thing.
But they had a bunch of people, and they styled themselves the God Squad. And they had the power to decide if a species would die. Now, I can tell you an approach to cope with things like that. The approach is written in the American Revolution. In the American Revolution, the property rights of everyone is protected equally. It's a very decentralized system, and it's the opposite system from feudalism. In feudalism, the powers, the government, the landed, they get to decide what's done. And if you want to do something with some land, the burden of proof is on you. In our system, you can do what you want to with your land unless what you do constitutes a common law nuisance. And that takes proving in a court. And that means, by the way, if there's a species and it does constitute an imminent harm to the American nation and its people, then under that standard, the people could be stopped, any person could be stopped from using his property. But that's not what we do today. What we do today is we have these, what happened in that issue? What happened was the people who were trying to stop housing development, so people could have houses to live in Southern California, and you were representing them, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service gave a grant to the opponents in the middle of a proceeding before them, because the opponents wrote that you, Hugh Hewitt, had made a really good argument, and they needed more money to refute it, so they could then go before this body that would supply the money and plead better, more effectively, and they gave them the money.
Yep.
And you discovered that. Now, the point is, that's a conflict of interest. Now, in the disposition of providence, human beings are not to be trusted to be judges in their own cause. And the Constitution of the United States is supposed to stop that. And so the Natural Resources Defense Council, that's who it was, I remember, and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service and whoever else was involved, they all get more powerful if they rule a certain way.
But we were young then, Larry Arnn, and we are now middle-aged.
That's correct.
And in those 20 years, the government has doubled and doubled again in size, scope, and authority, so that as we sit here before the United States Supreme Court, a case in which I'm not involved, Pacific Legal Foundation case, Sackett versus the EPA, concerns the EPA's order to a quarter-acre lot owner on a lake in Idaho that they stop building a house, they put back the alleged wetland that was there, or they will be charged $37,500 per day. And this couple has no judicial review, and they've managed to get the Supreme Court on this due process argument. Tell me why you think this is retrievable. What would the framers think about someone being told they could not build a house between other houses on the allegation of an administrative agency under threat of confiscatory fines? What would they, we're so far beyond recapturing it that it really does raise the question about why try?
They're not trends, they're choices. So this situation is bad, I agree. But in 1861, Abraham Lincoln, without executive experience, arrives in a castle, in a capital where assassins are waiting to greet him. The city surrounded by hostile forces, issuing a call for an army to come, having no idea whether anybody would come or not. They came from here, this place. More in percentage terms than from any place, non-military. How did he know they'd come? He didn't know they'd come. And so what these forces that you're talking about, they're mighty and they're entrenched and they're powerful. Is this justice? Because if it isn't, it will make its own case against itself. And then think of the people, the forces that are arrayed for the just thing, for the beauty and freedom of the Constitution of the United States are in principle infinite. Nothing can overcome those. If people will hear the call of the lovely thing of equal justice and human freedom.
One of your heroes is Winston Churchill, and we've spoken a lot about him today with your students, and you've mentioned him. Of course, he did the same thing Lincoln did in even perhaps more dire circumstances. And so he summoned back a country, and he saved a people, and he saved a civilization. And 70 years later, what do you think of that work? What's left?
The answer is people can still write what they want to in the newspaper, and they can still speak on the radio or over the internet. Their relations are not interrogated about their private behavior. They're not hauled up in front of courts that are just creatures of the executive. There's some instances of that in the modern world now. We're getting more of that, right? But the truth is, that's not how we live right now. And pray God we don't live like that. But remember, and so if they had lost that war, what was going to happen to France? What was happening to France because they lost that war? Was it a good thing to fall under the administration of the Nazi regime or the communist regime, either one of them? And the thing is, this is not like that. We've got an argument and a chance to vote. We should do it more skillfully, right? Because there is a choice to be made. And the main thing I appeal for is simple. We should spend some time defining the terms of the choice. Now, I'm outraged, and I only brought up that thing from 20 years ago because you and I did that together. I was involved in that too, and you were very honorable in that thing. And you know, I didn't do so bad myself. And that was wrong, I thought. But I'm not arguing about what to do about that rat. And what I'm arguing about is it's a conflict of interest in the government. Judges should not be partisans in the controversies they are hearing. Can't everybody see that?
No, the left doesn't. I mean, and that's what the problem is. Let me ask you about your approach. You've been lecturing on the Constitution for 6 weeks, and we want people to go back and watch those. And in the middle of that lecture occurred one of the most interesting constitutional issues in my 20 years of teaching, which is the President of the United States ordered that a missile be delivered into the moving vehicle containing 2 American citizens. And I'll stipulate that I would be satisfied and you would be satisfied that they were evildoers, to use the previous president's term, intent upon doing harm to the United States. But how would an originalist like you approach President Obama? Said, Dr. Arnn, what does the Constitution say about this? How would you approach that?
Well, executive power is a terrible thing, and it always was. And in a war, you know, you think Continental Army soldiers didn't go take people's property when they needed it and stuff like that. Wrongs were done. It's a shame that they were done. And the way you have to judge that is, first of all, is the president accountable? There's going to be an election pretty soon. Are the facts knowable? In general, right? And you know, the Constitution sets out to solve a problem. And the problem is still acute, and that is people require to be governed. They must live under law or they will live in misery. And the law is the most powerful single thing. How do you arrange the law so that it doesn't oppress the people it's supposed to protect? Well, that's the whole point of the Constitution, right? You know that, and you're on the radio, and you're calling it into question, right? And there's people in Congress, and many of them are not very friendly with the Obama administration, and they call up and ask him questions. And he had a big majority in both houses, and he lost the majority in one by a lot, and the other one is much narrower now. And so the point is, the system is functioning. The protections are in things like that. And the only thing I'm calling for is their preservation.
You have got a new book coming up, The Founder's Key, The Divine and Natural Connection Between the Declaration and the Constitution and What We Risk by Losing It. Now, I know you're careful about your titles, and so there's a lot implied in this, The Founder's Key. So begin by telling me what you think that is.
The key of the founders is the unity of a set of principles and a set of institutions. They thought that the principles of politics are equality and freedom, established in the laws of nature and nature's God, and they thought that there were certain kinds of political institutions that would preserve those over time, and that those were not within a wide range. Those three main features of the Constitution I named, limited government representation and separation of powers, those are all named in the Declaration of Independence. They're also named in the Virginia Declaration of Right and the Virginia Constitution, which were written at the same time and are basically the same document written by the same people. And so the first step, I think, is to understand that the principles of the country imply a kind of rule. And that kind of rule is set up in the Constitution, and that's one of the two contenders about how we're going to be ruled today. So that's the point. The point is, I don't get to decide what happens to the United States of America. I just get to speak my piece. We all get to decide. And what I would encourage people to understand is the choice is stark and important.
You also write in the title of the Founder's Key, the divine and natural connection between the Declaration and the Constitution and what we risk by losing it. Question 2, what do you mean by the divine connection?
Well, you can't understand the claim of human equality in the Declaration of Independence without understanding the relationship between man and God on the one hand and man and beast on the other. The Declaration of Independence names God 4 times. It implies, because it names him as each of the 3 branches of government, it implies that all of the powers of government would only be combined in the hands of God, nobody else. But also, and so, no man is entitled to rule another man or woman in the way that God or an angel would be entitled to rule any of us, they being more perfect beings. Or none is entitled to rule another man or woman in the way that any of us can rightly rule a dog or a pig. And so you have to understand this order of nature. Remember what Madison says when we're talking about Breyer. He says, government is the profoundest of all commentator on human nature. If men were angels, no, you can't understand it without that.
If men were angels, no government would be necessary.
And if angels were to govern men, neither internal nor external controls on the government would be needed. Now, it's also understood that we are a part of a nature with God at its top, and he is the providence that establishes all that we see around us. Those are the doctrines of the Declaration of Independence. They're written explicitly there. And the main features of the United States Constitution are embedded in that providence according to the document. So it says. So that's what I mean by the divine and the natural connections. Now, it says the laws of nature and of nature's God. What are those? Those are the moral laws that we see by our reason, reinforced by our faith. And there's a wide, almost complete overlap between those two things.
I had on my radio show not long ago the architect of the same-sex marriage statute in New York, very brilliant lawyer, served with Governor Cuomo for 4 years as the Attorney General, then was put in charge of him as Chief of Staff of passing this. And I asked him if he did not think this was gambling with big stakes, given 2,500 years of Western civilization. He thought not. What do you think?
Well, the word nature comes from the Latin word for birth. And the way children grow up, human beings have a nature. And in a college, you can really see the nature. The way children grow up is it takes them a very long time. The distinctive thing about it, compared to other beings, is it takes them forever. And they need a lot of help. And all of us are necessitous creatures. We have lives. We live for several decades. If our kids are going to take 2 of those decades, it takes a commitment, right? Meanwhile, we got to be making a living. The raising of children is a transfer of wealth from the middle-aged to the young. But that's also true. I don't know about your parents. My parents and my wife's parents are all gone now.
Yes.
And they all went the same way. That is to say, they suffered a decline. They had in all 4 cases, they had provided for themselves so that they didn't really need money from us. What they needed was love and disinterested care from us. They needed somebody around them for whom it was not just a transaction. So all I'm saying is the family is a natural thing. Interesting thing to tamper with that.
We will see. Now, last in your title, what we risk by losing it, losing the Founder's Key, which is the title. What is that? I mean, there's always a better government to invent, isn't there, Dr. Arndt?
No. Well, I don't think so, but a simple answer to the question is, this is the most successful free country in human history. to change it fundamentally, to depart from its fundamental precepts and practices, is a big step. So that, right? But then the second step, there's a warning from the founders, and that is, if you actually are going to give limitless or almost limitless power to people in the name of their expertise, because that's the justification is, it's a complex society and we have a lot of scientific training. You should let us figure it out, right? And we'll be disinterested. There's a really great article that's in our Constitution Reader, referred to in my book is where it is. It's cited by it's written by R.J. Pastrito, one of our teachers here.
Oh, yeah. He'll be on my radio show today.
And he's really good. And what he does is he writes a piece about the separation of powers in the new modern administrative state. And they think that it's not needed because these people will be scientifically competent and therefore unlikely to abuse our rights. They'll be disinterested because they'll have tenure and good salaries, and so they won't want anything, you know.
I've been in a lot of faculty meetings.
Yeah, they won't want anything. But remember, these are the same people who claim at the same time that rich people in corporations are still very avaricious, despite the fact that they have great wealth, right? And so, but these people, and you can't have separation of powers getting in the way because it'll make everything too slow. You just got to let them work because they're the ones who know. And that's a clear choice, right? And, you know, I will tell you, there's something to that argument. Somebody who goes and gets a PhD and, you know, has, you know, most of these people in the bureaucracy don't have that, but let's say somebody does have that. Well, that's not easy to do. And it takes virtues both of intellect and of character to do that. And that means that they probably are particularly excellent people. Are they more excellent, say, than George Washington, who was a very excellent human being? And his constant practice is that he would take no power from anyone except it was limited and theirs to take back when they wanted. So it's a form of the question, what is the title to rule? Is it consent because we say they can rule us? Or is it because of some virtue in them that gives them power over us? That's the oldest question in political philosophy.
You have, and I have had a conversation over the years about statesmen. In fact, you presume to teach it here. You are trying to teach statesmanship. More on that in a moment. But you've often told the story of Washington approached by his officers to take power, and you've also told the story of Churchill's election. And in both cases, the executive declined to take the power and immediately resigned his office. Is that the essence of statesmanship? Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's a fundamental requirement of statesmanship. Those guys were humble without having as much as most of us have to be humble about. So the other part of statesmanship is, you know, I said to you earlier today, you asked me about some politician, and you said he thinks he's kind of like Churchill. Well, I've been studying Churchill now for a very long time, you know, 30-some years. All you got to do is go find something that man wrote and compare it to something Winston Churchill wrote. He was a beautiful thinker and speaker and writer. And then in incredibly complex situations, he proved that he could be trusted with power. And one of the prime ways he proved that was that he laid it down the second he was asked.
Now, I want to ask about another conversation we had today as we walked around Hillsdale's beautiful campus, is that you have a renovation program. You have to go back, and some of these buildings, what, 1844, the campus was founded?
Yeah.
Do you have any 1844 buildings?
We have an 1853 building.
That must require a little bit of work. And
Yeah.
But they still serve. The question in a constitutional republic is when institutions no longer serve. One of those might be the states. I still live in California. You fled wisely. And it's dysfunctional. It's broken. And in fact, it probably is beyond repair. And there are many states which are not, but most are. And so the 10th Amendment protects the power of dysfunctional despotisms, actually, when it comes to the bureaucratic state in these places. Is that an institution that has to be repaired? I mean, do you really take seriously the 10th Amendment in these states, or ought we not to get more efficient?
That's a good question. Well, first of all, states don't have rights, people have rights. So the American system works like this. It's very lovely how it works, and it's not that hard to understand. If you locate sovereignty in a large, vibrant, private society, then representation becomes possible. And once you got that, then they can delegate to this or that or the other place. And they can separate to whom they delegate it. Now, the Constitution of the United States has 7 articles. One of the articles is about how to ratify the Constitution of the United States. One is about how to amend it. One of them is about the transition from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution of the United States. That leaves 4. One of them is about the legislative branch. One of them is about the executive branch. One of them is about the judicial branch. And one of them is about the states. The people of the United States have delegated their authority, it's their authority, no one else's, to those 4 areas. And that is an essential, federalism is actually just an aspect of separation of powers. And so, of course it's needed, unless you believe that men have become angels. Now, you worry about the states and they're dysfunctional. Well, first of all, it's because the system has become so confused and mixed up together. It's not the arbitrary power of the states, it's that they're subsidized, commanded, and liberated in awkward ways that encourages bad behavior. And you know, a simple idea, constitutional idea, is things that are mainly local are best done mainly by local people. And if you want to see the truth of that, I know you teach, right? And here's what I learned teaching. I learned that my excellence is, if I have it, when I have it, is very helpful and very important and maybe even necessary. But it cannot for any second of time in a class replace the energy and the excellence of the students. You can't do it for them, even if you love them, even if you want to. And by the way, when you try to do it all for them, what you succeed in doing is boring them. At least that's what I seem to be able to do. So if I ask them a lot of questions and disagree with what they say, we all learn a lot, and together. So isn't that a model of constitutional rule?
Yes.
And shouldn't the states then manage the things that mainly concern the states?
But is there a danger, and then I want to conclude with a couple of questions that set the table for future conversations with you, Article 5 and Article 6. But I want to, if the states have become so corrupt, because they've come into the rule of bureaucrats who pass bills that benefit themselves and take the money to benefit themselves, can you get that back? Even in a state like California, where initiatives pass and then are routinely ignored by the people, Proposition 209, which upheld Lincoln's vision and banished discrimination based on race. Legislature just passed a bill ignoring it. And so it is in essence a lawless regime now, with a form of lawfulness, which makes it doubly difficult to deal with.
Yeah. So the answer is, we don't call this a great crisis because it's not, right? This is a problem. But here's what I think about that. Also remember this, in the correspondence between Madison and Washington and Hamilton and a few others to call the Constitutional Convention, the big topic is abuses of people's rights by states. The constitutional system is supposed to help stop that, right? And that means there's a federal guarantee of one right to one's property. Is the states taking it? They shouldn't. So if you could work your way back, as I say, I don't think that you're going to get very far by immediately assailing the thicket of, try to get somebody to give California an order to clean up its act and become a decent government again. It's not going to do that tomorrow. But if instead you started working on these, as I say, on these points, at the federal level and in every state where it's opportune, the government should be limited, it should be representative, and its power should be separated. If you start doing that, then opportunities are going to come up over time. And California is going to have to get its fiscal house in order.
They will default.
Yeah.
They will default. Let me conclude, as we're running out of time, and I don't want to have your audience not hear you comment on this. There was a conference at Harvard 2 weeks ago, organized by Lawrence Lessig, famous constitutional scholar, man of the left, participated in by Mark Meckler, founder of Tea Party Patriots. I want to talk about the Tea Party, on whether or not Article 5 ought to be triggered. Ought we not to just get together in a convention and redo this. You've spent a lot of time thinking about this. What do you think of that idea?
Well, in general, I'm for restoring the Constitution, not changing it. I think it's really good. I also think we probably wouldn't be as good at writing a new one as the ones who wrote the first one, you know, given who we are at this day and age. Also, the first one has 2 centuries of success behind it. So why don't we repair that? Why don't we go back to trying to obey that?
Well, it's their argument that a convention would be just that, a little touch-up,
Yeah.
coifing.
So you're going to alter the document, right?
Yes.
I would repeal the 17th Amendment if it were I.
That's where I was going as well.
And,
Why would you do that? Tell
well,
people what the 17th Amendment is first.
Well, the 17th Amendment provides for the direct election of senators by popular vote in the states. And of course, now there's a big outcry against the Senate itself. They think it should become like the House of Representatives. Everything should represent people equally. That will effectively urbanize the constituency of America and shift the country to the left.
Significantly.
I think so, but I think that may be why they're for it. But you have to understand why it was done the way it was done. Because as I say, the states have a kind of parallel standing in the scheme of separation of powers to the separation at the federal level. It's set up that way. That's partly an accident, by the way. Some of the most important ones didn't go to the Constitutional Convention meaning to do that, but they did a lot of work in those months. And they stood by it for a long time after. And if you read the Federalist Papers, they turn what they did into a beautiful scheme. Now, the 17th Amendment, and so it's the pattern of the Constitution that each branch of government gets to protect itself by having some share in the powers of the other branch. So the president has a veto over the Congress. The Congress controls the budget that the executive branch spends, stuff like that. There's a lot of things like that, checks and balances. It's the thing that probably made us all, when we were in school, roll our eyes, that's a boring subject. I'm telling you, it's not a boring subject anymore. It's amazing. Well, the states have their place. They get to control the Senate of the United States. And if you wonder why the federal government gobbles up all the power in the country, and then, by the way, makes states administrative oblasts under the federal authority, which is to a considerable extent what they are now, as that happens, that would be stopped if they had the Senate. And, you know, so I think that was a mistake. Now, of course, it was an amendment to the Constitution, and that means the great majority of people wanted it when they did it. I recognize that. I'm calling for us to rethink that.
The book on prohibition by the New York Times editor that came out points out that amendments can be hastily and ill-considered.
Yeah.
And so it's not always a good idea. I want to ask you about the...
Remember, the 18th Amendment we did when we were drunk.
Yep.
And the 21st Amendment we did when we were sober.
I want to go back to 1787, and I'm not done with the article questions for you yet, but given your study of that, I was in Independence Hall this past summer, and I am always amazed that in 4.5 months, this group of 4 dozen very different people sat there and came up with this. Why was that possible? What was it about that group of people that could produce this document that I think you're saying really cannot be improved upon, at least at this time, by the people who would attempt to do so?
Well, of course, nobody's claiming it's perfect. And it's also, by the way, incomplete. The slavery provisions indicate that. And it was completed at very great cost in blood and treasure, some of it paid by people who went to school here, much of it, in fact. So the point is, it's not a perfect document. It's just the best thing of its kind ever. And how'd they do that? Well, they were very extraordinary people, and they had a common idea about a goal. They differed about a lot of things, but you know, that's the magic of America is the incredible force that is unleashed when a people have a set of principles to serve that brings them into collaboration with each other and then liberates them to do what they want. And both things matter. The principle of organization, the equality of man, the laws of nature and of nature's God, the constitutional provisions, those are broad rules and goals. In American government for 100 people, this is a big thing people should understand. In American government for 150 to 75 years, there were no detailed administrative regulations in domestic matters coming from Washington. Basically none. So the Homestead Act gives away 10% of the land area of the United States, and it's under 1,400 words long. Words long. It's very lovely. And so the point is, that's how, you know, ask anybody who's really good at managing a company. I think around here we're really good at managing a college. We've got an idea about it. Well, one of the key things is everybody carries the burden of his own work and has to do the main job of guiding the work. So you don't govern people by detailed rules. You govern them by goals and broad ways of proceeding. And you have to have systems and stuff so you can check up and make sure everything's okay. But the main enforcer of any policy has got to be the person who's carrying out the policy. And that means you don't want to set up a whole bunch of ombudsmen and auditors and stuff. You have to have a system like that. You have to have a system where basically most people tell the truth and have the same goal and mean it and are pretty good at their jobs, and then they help you figure out how to go about it. And you know, this place, we run it like that, and people tend to be happy here.
I thought you were going to say, maybe you just haven't had a chance to say it yet, that in 1787, those men, they were all men, had an education in common, and that education was specific and particular, and it was an education in government, it was an education in philosophy, and that you really can't hope to improve upon a document or repair it unless you have people who have a similar education.
Yeah. We have a lot of bad habits now that they didn't have then. And it is true that they, you know, Washington says, you know, we live in an epocha when the rights of man have been better understood than any other. They were very up on that. That was a culture among them. And they lived in a society where people did a lot for themselves. And, you know, that we don't so much anymore. Partly it's our success that's made that possible. So, yeah, those conditions have changed. But what I would say is their account, by the way, in the beginning of the Federalist Papers and other places about how this all happened, they start with the fact, they make two arguments, right? First is the conditions are right here, right now. There's a lot of things that are going right. But then, you know, the independence of the people, the spirit among them, their self-reliance, their sense of equality, their good character, their faith. Those are all things that mattered a lot. But then they make a separate argument, remember, and the second argument is, this thing we're doing is true. It's not just that we've been conditioned to think this. This thing can be vindicated in open argument as a truth. And they came to believe that. And you know, when the Constitutional Convention was over, it was very clever how they did it. And they, you know, by only requiring 9 states and some things like that, they set up powerful biases in favor of its passing. And it might not have passed, except they did that. Nearly didn't anyway. But on the other hand, think of what happened after. First of all those people who stayed and supported it immediately went home in controversial stations and circumstances and argued for its ratification. But then second, what was the deal that was made in the big states that were reluctant? And remember, the big states with the most powerful political systems, that's where they were reluctant, right? Virginia, Massachusetts, and New York. And so when the deal was struck, in Massachusetts and Virginia especially, what did they ask for? They didn't say, okay, I need 100,000 acres on the other side of the Smoky Mountains. They didn't say, I need the following 50 people appointed to high places in the government from my state. They said, we want you to add a Bill of Rights. That is, a bunch of high words about freedom and purpose and limit of government. I will agree to this if you will give me that. Now, there's nothing corrupt about that bargain. and in New York too. That's what they asked for. By then, New York kind of had to because it had enough votes. And the point is, if that's a corrupt political bargain, I like that one. But then second, they also said, we need your word on this. We'll pass it so you can go ahead and implement it, not placing conditions that make us start all this over again. You tell us you're going to do this. Best efforts, legal term, as you know. And they all said, yes, we will. And sure enough, James Madison did. So doesn't that show what the consensus was among them? And it was a consensus of principle and conviction.
And I want to conclude by talking about a specific article, Article 6, and the religious test prohibition, which is there, because it's much in the news, and people don't know what it means. They don't know why it's there. So I thought I'd ask you, what does that mean? Why is it being debated now, and why did they put it there?
Well, they put it there because they believed in religious freedom. Civil and religious freedom are the goods that this college was, by the way, founded explicitly to serve. Civil and religious freedom and intelligent piety. But they thought that it's most beautifully put, and I know of, in George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, shortly after he became president. And we put a quote from that, by the way, on our Christmas card every year at Hillsdale College. If you're on our mailing list, you get one. And the point is, we have a right, each one of us, to perform our duty to our Maker and be accountable to Him. And that is not to be interfered with only one caveat that's in the letter to the Hebrew congregation. He said, Washington says to the Jews to whom he's writing, and we think this is the first letter ever a chief executive of any country except Israel ever addressed to some Jews, calling them equal citizens. And he says, the country demands that each citizen conduct himself on all occasions, demean himself on all occasions as a good citizen, giving his country his effectual support. So, short of offenses against nature or the family or the property, child sacrifice won't do, then given that, our conscience is our right. Our property is a right because it's the protector of our conscience. And so it means that. And so the test about anybody from some minority religion would be, is that religion encouraging and is the person capable of exercising good citizenship? Because unless that's not true, that person has a sacred and constitutional right to practice his religion without penalty.
Dr. Larry Arnn, congratulations on the series, and I hope you do it again soon when the new book, The Founder's Key, comes out.
Thank you, Hugh.